head of the Iraqi Foundation for Democracy and Development in London. He's quite pro-Western. He explained, this is an election year for Iraq. No one wants to appear that he's appeasing the Americans. Anti-Americanism is popular now in Iraq, as indeed it's been throughout. The facts that are familiar to anyone who's read the Western-run polls, the Pentagon-run polls. Well, the current U.S. efforts to prevent the legally required referendum are extremely revealing. Sometimes they're called democracy promotion. Well, while Obama's signaling very clearly his intention to establish a firm and large-scale presence in the region, he's also, as you know, sharply escalating the AfPak war, following Petraeus' strategy to drive the Taliban into Pakistan with potentially awful results for this extremely dangerous and unstable state, which is facing insurrections throughout its territory. These are the most extreme in the tribal areas, which cross the AfPak border. It's an artificial line imposed by the British called the Durand Line, and the same people live on both sides of it, Pashtun tribes, and they've never accepted it. In fact, the Afghanistan government never accepted it either, as long as it was independent. Well, that's where most of the fighting's going on. One of the leading specialists on the region, Zelig Harrison, he recently wrote that the outcome of Washington's current policies, Obama's policies, might well be what he calls an Islamic Pashtunistan, Pashtun-based separate kind of quasi-state. The Pakistani ambassador had warned that if the Taliban and Pashtun nationalism merge, we've had it, and we're on the verge of that. The prospects become still more ominous with the escalation of drone attacks that embitter the population with a huge civilian toll, and more recently, just a couple of days ago in fact, with the unprecedented authority that has just been granted to General Stanley McChrystal. He's taking charge. He's a kind of a wild-eyed special forces assassin. He's been put in charge of heading the operations. Petraeus' own counterinsurgency advisor in Iraq, General David Kilcullen, Colonel, I think, he describes the Obama-Petraeus McChrystal policies as a fundamental strategic error which may lead to the collapse of Pakistan. He says it's a calamity that would dwarf all other current issues given the country's size, strategic location, and nuclear stockpile. It's also not too encouraging that Pakistan and India are now rapidly expanding their nuclear arsenals. Pakistan's nuclear arsenals were developed with Reagan's crucial aid, and India's nuclear weapons program has got a major shot in the arm with the recent U.S.-India nuclear agreement. It's also a sharp blow to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Two countries have twice come close to nuclear war over Kashmir, and they're also engaged in a kind of a proxy war in Afghanistan. These developments pose a very serious threat to world peace, even to human survival. Well, a lot to say about this crisis, but no time here. Coming back home, whether the deceit here about the monstrous enemy was sincere or not, Johnson's case might well have been sincere. Suppose that, say, 50 years ago, Americans had been given a choice of directing their tax money to development of information technology so that their grandchildren could have iPods and the internet, or else putting the same funds into developing a livable and sustainable socioeconomic order. Well, they might very well have made the latter choice, but they had no choice. And that's standard. There's a striking gap between public opinion and public policy on a host of major issues, domestic and foreign. And at least in my judgment, public opinion is often a lot more sane. It's also tends to be fairly consistent over time, which is pretty astonishing, because public concerns and aspirations, if they're even mentioned, are marginalized and ridiculed. That's one very significant feature of the yawning democratic deficit, as we call it in other countries. It's the failure of formal democratic institutions to function properly. And that's no trivial matter. Arundhati Roy has a book soon to come out in which she asks whether the evolution of formal democracy in India and the United States, in fact, not only there, her words, might turn out to be the end game of the human race. And that's not an idle question. It should be recalled that the American Republic was founded on the principle that there should be a democratic deficit. James Madison, the main framer of the constitutional order, his view was that power should be in the hands of the wealth of the nation, the more responsible set of men who have sympathy for property owners and their rights. Madison sought to construct a system of government that would, in his words, protect the minority of the opulent from the majority. That's why the constitutional system that he framed did not have co-equal branches. The executive was supposed to be an administrator, and the legislature was supposed to be dominant, but not the House of Representatives, and rather the Senate, where power was vested and protected from the public in many ways. That's where the wealth of the nation would be concentrated. This is not overlooked by historians. Gordon Wood, for example, summarizes the thoughts of the founders, saying that the Constitution was intrinsically an aristocratic document designed to check the democratic tendencies of the period, delivering power to a better sort of people and excluding those who were not rich, well-born, or prominent from exercising political power. All through American history, there's been a constant struggle over this constrained version of democracy, and popular struggles have won a great many rights. Nevertheless, concentrated power and privilege clings to the Madisonian conception. It changes form as circumstances change. By World War II, there was a significant change. Business leaders and elite intellectuals recognized that the public had won enough rights so that they can't be controlled by force. So it would be necessary to do something else, namely to turn to control of attitudes and opinions. These were the days when the huge public relations industry emerged in the freest countries in the world, Britain and the United States, where the problem was most severe. The public relations industry was devoted to what Walter Lippmann approvingly called a new art in the practice of democracy, the manufacture of consent. It's called the engineering of consent, in the phrase of his contemporary Edward Bernays, one of the founders of the PR industry. Both Lippmann and Bernays had taken part in Woodrow Wilson's state propaganda agency, which Committee on Public Information was its Orwellian term. It was created to try to drive a pacifist population to jingoist fanaticism and hatred of all things German. And it succeeded brilliantly, in fact. And it was hoped that the same techniques could ensure that what are called the intelligent minorities would rule, and that the general public, who Lippmann called ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, would serve their function as spectators, not participants. These are all very highly respected progressive essays on democracy by people by a man who was the leading public intellectual of the 20th century and was a Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy progressive, as Bernays was. And they capture the thinking of progressive opinion. So President Wilson, he held that an elite of gentlemen with elevated ideals must be empowered to preserve stability and righteousness, essentially the perspective of the Founding Fathers. In more recent years, the gentlemen are transmuted into the technocrats